Welcome. There's a lot in the news about Russia. So in this episode of How We Got Here, we're going to look at Russian history beginning in the 19th century. Richard Nixon stated in 1960, law has generally been thought of as a curb on arbitrary power. Law in the Soviet Union is not conceived as a check on power. It is openly and proudly an expression of power. So back in the early 19th century, there was a character named Rasputin. He was described as the Holy Devil. He moved to St. Petersburg in 1906 and began to gain access to the royal family of Tsar Nicholas II. Posing as a mystic, Rasputin was known for strange prophecies, claims of superstitious healing powers, and very immoral excesses. As the Tsar and his family came under Rasputin's spell, the monarch's credibility suffered. His authority was undermined and public distrust spread. At this time, Tsar Nicholas escalated his father's policy of restricting Jews and implementing a full anti-Jewish pogrom of cruel persecution. Rasputin is portrayed as the evil villain in the 20th Century Fox animated movie Anastasia in 1997, starring the voices of Meg Ryan, John Cusack, Kelsey Grammer, and Angela Lansbury. Well, more than 2 million Jews fled Russia, many to the United States. This was the setting of the play Fiddler on the Roof. Though the expulsion was a tragedy, it spared those who fled. The ones that stayed suffered a Russian genocide of Jews. Well, World War I started in 1914, and the fighting raged from Europe to the Middle East. The Tsar sent 3 million Russian soldiers west to fight Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II. Unprepared to face German heavy artillery, over 78,000 Russians were killed or wounded, and over 90,000 captured at the Battle of Tannenberg, August 26th to 30th, 1914. Within a year, over 1.4 million Russian soldiers were killed and nearly 1 million captured. Russian General Denikin described, the German heavy artillery swept away whole lines of trenches and their defenders with them. We hardly replied. There was nothing with which we could reply. Our regiments, although completely exhausted, were beating off one attack after another by bayonet. Blood flowed unendingly. The ranks became thinner and thinner and thinner. The number of graves multiplied. So Russia's disillusionment with the Tsar grew. This, together with severe cold weather and food shortages, allowed Vladimir Lenin to organize his communist followers to agitate and fan unrest, leading to the Bolshevik Revolution, the Red October of 1917. Lenin distributed propaganda, incited class warfare, provoked strikes, staged bank robberies, attacked police, ordered assassinations. Democrat President Woodrow Wilson naively told Congress April 2nd, 1917, does not every American feel that assurance has been added to our hope for the future peace of the world by the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening within the last few weeks in Russia? Wilson displayed his complete lack of judgment by sending the U.S. Army 339th Infantry Regiment to Russia to intervene in North Russia. With the backdrop of Lenin's agitating, the Duma, the Russian parliament, forced the Tsar from power. This was followed by chaotic protests, mutinies, and strikes. Lenin seized control of government, then proceeded to arrest and imprison and execute tens of thousands of Russians in a Red Terror. This sad history was portrayed in the 1957 movie Dr. Zhivago, starring Omar Sharif, together with Julie Christie, Rod Steiger, and Alec Guinness. Well, Lenin lured his opponents into inactivity through his Operation Trust, making them think that there was a secret plan being worked behind the scenes to return the Tsar to power. Instead, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed. The small number of Lenin's revolutionaries used terror as a coercive tactic. People panicked and unwittingly surrendered their freedoms. Lenin wrote, "It is necessary secretly and urgently to prepare the terror." Lenin sent a telegram to his socialist revolutionaries in the city of Nizhny Novgorod, instructing them to induce mass terror. History shows that once dictators seize power, their primary goal is to stay in power by eliminating opposition. Lenin began by kicking off his opposition, mainly the kulak farmers. Historian Robert Conquest, in Reflections on the Ravaged Century, 2001, described kulaks as peasants with a couple of cows or 5 or 6 acres. Many kulaks were Dutch Anabaptists called Mennonites, who followed the teachings of 16th century reformer Menno Simons, who advocated nonviolence, very similar to the Quakers and the Amish and the Hutterites. The Mennonites fled religious persecution in Europe and then settled in Poland, which was part of the Kingdom of Prussia. When King Frederick the Great of Prussia in the middle 1700s began to militarize and recruit the youth as soldiers, the Mennonites sought to move again. This time, that Catherine the Great of Russia in 1762 sought farmers to settle in Ukraine, which she called New Russia, and sent her agent, George Trapp, to invite the West Prussian Mennonites. So in 1786, these Mennonites began to migrate, and they were granted a privilegium, or the privilege of protection of freedom of worship and exemption from military service, though the negotiators subtly slipped in the line "for a time." Well, little did the Mennonite kulaks realize that the land they were being moved to was a buffer territory between Russia and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. This land would be the battleground for invasions by Turks, Napoleon during the Crimean War, Britain, France, Austria, and Prussia. Following these conflicts, that land was the area where the Balkan Wars took place and World War I, and even the wars today. During the late 1800s, many Ukrainian Mennonites immigrated to Canada and Western United States. The Mennonite kulak farmers who stayed in Russia were decimated by Lenin. Lenin instructed his soldiers, "Comrades, the kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. You must make examples of these people. Hang them, I mean publicly, so that people see it. At least 100 kulaks, rich bloodsuckers. Publish their names, seize their grain, single out the hostages per my instruction in yesterday's telegram. Do all this so for miles around people see it, understand it, tremble, and tell themselves that we are killing the bloodthirsty kulaks and that we will continue to do so. Yours, Lenin. P.S. Find tougher people." Well, the policy of dekulakization, the intentional killing off of millions of independent middle-class kulaks, farmers, removed the only ones who could possibly challenge Lenin's power. It also had the unintended consequence of devastating the farms, the food production. And so there was a horrendous national famine in 1921 and 22 in Russia, where an estimated 5 million people died. Well, the Bolsheviks replaced the Christian religion with a materialistic atheism. Church property was confiscated or destroyed. Free speech and free press were prohibited. Private property was abolished. Karl Marx had written in The Critique of the Gotha Program, Part 4, "Between capitalist and communist societies, there lies the period of the revolutionary transformation." While centralizing power, Vladimir Lenin considered socialism as simply a transition phase from capitalism to communism. "The goal of socialism is communism," said Lenin. C.S. Lewis, in the final chapter of The Abolition of Man, 1943, warned of atheists concentrating power. I am very doubtful whether history shows us one example of a man who, having stepped outside traditional morality and attained power, has used that power benevolently. So once somebody without God gets power, they use it selfishly. In 1924, as Lenin lay dying, suffering from incessant headaches, Joseph Stalin usurped power. Even though they were political enemies, Stalin circulated a fake photo, doctored to make it look as if he and Lenin were friends. Stalin manipulated the public with propaganda and ruled with an iron fist. FDR described the Soviet Union under Stalin to the American Youth Congress, February 10th, 1940. The Soviet Union is run by a dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. Well, Stalin was an absolute dictator, and Patrick J. Kiger wrote for the History Channel, April 16th, 2019, how Joseph Stalin starved millions in the Ukrainian famine. He writes, cruel efforts under Stalin to impose collectivism and tamp down Ukrainian nationalism left an estimated 3.9 million dead. Alex DeWall, executive director of the World Peace Foundation and author of Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine in 2018, wrote, the Ukrainian famine was a clear case of a man-made famine aimed at a particular population for repression or punishment. Anne Applebaum described in her book, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, 2017, how Stalin's secret police further made plans to deport 50,000 Ukrainian families from Ukraine to Siberia. There is a similar concern today because the World Economic Forum's Great Reset is involving the collapse of the world food supply to bring about a dependence on global government. Klaus Schwab stated, if the past 5 centuries in Europe and America have taught us anything, it is that acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. Well, the founders of modern communism, Marx and Engels, in their collected works, explained, conspirators by no means confine themselves to organizing. Their business consists in spurring it into artificial crises. They are alchemists of the revolution. Richard Pipes wrote in Communism and History how Stalin used a government-fabricated crisis, which he blamed on his opponents as an excuse to seize more power. Stalin's regime needed another crisis, Richard Pipes wrote, as Fidel Castro, the leader of communist Cuba, would explain, the revolution needs the enemy. The revolution needs for its development its antithesis. If enemies were lacking, they had to be fabricated. Pipes continued, in 1934, a prominent Bolshevik, Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad, was assassinated under mysterious conditions. Evidence points to Stalin. Kirov was gaining too much popularity in party ranks for Stalin's comfort. His assassination brought 2 advantages. It rid him of a potential rival and provided a rationale for instigating a vast campaign against the alleged anti-Soviet conspirators. Pipes concluded, purges of the 1930s were a terror campaign that in indiscriminate ferocity and numbers of victims had no parallel in world history. Authorities beat them till they confessed to crimes they have not committed. Stalin's Great Purge of 1936 executed an estimated 1.2 million government officials, military leaders, and peasants who were accused of being disloyal. Simply a rumor of holding a politically incorrect view or associating with enemies of the people could result in someone losing their job, being arrested, and executed. 4.5 million were sentenced to Gulag labor camps. One of those arrested was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was born in Russia, December 11, 1918. Solzhenitsyn was detained for writing a letter criticizing Joseph Stalin, and for that, he spent 11 years in Gulag labor camps. Solzhenitsyn began to secretly compile horror stories of life in these gulags. For several years of his imprisonment, 1947 to 52, he was denied pen and paper. So he memorized and committed to memory poems he made up, documenting his experiences. He put these accounts into his first book, The First Circle, 1968, and then into his most famous work, The Gulag Archipelago. An archipelago is a chain of islands in the ocean, yet he was using it as a metaphor for a chain of FEMA-style citizen detention camps across Russia. Solzhenitsyn's writings were smuggled out of the Soviet Union and translated. They quickly became internationally popular, leading to him receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, even though he was still in the Soviet Union. In his Nobel Prize acceptance letter, Solzhenitsyn wrote, "During all the years until 1961, not only was I convinced I should never see a single line of mine in print in my lifetime, but I also scarcely dared allow any of my close acquaintances to read anything I had written, because I feared this would become known." International pressure led to Solzhenitsyn's being expelled from Russia on February 12th in 1974. Warning naive American students of the horrible realities of socialism, Alexander Solzhenitsyn stated in Washington, D.C., 1975, "In pre-revolutionary Russia, there were attempts on the Tsar's life. During these years, about 17 persons a year were executed. The Cheka, Lenin's communist secret police, in 1918 and 19 executed without trial more than 1,000 persons a month. At the height of Stalin's terror, 1938 to 39, more than 40,000 persons were shot per month. Here are the figures: 17 a year, 1,000 a month, 40,000 a month." Solzhenitsyn explained, "The state of war only serves as an excuse for domestic tyranny." He continued, "Roosevelt in Tehran, where there was a meeting with Churchill and Stalin, Roosevelt in Tehran, during one of his toasts, said, 'I do not doubt that the three of us lead our people in accordance with their desires.' We were astonished. We thought, when we reach Europe, we will meet the Americans and we will tell them." And so this is during World War II. "I was among the troops that were marching toward the Elbe River in East Germany. A little bit more, I would have shaken hands with your American soldiers. But just before that, I was taken off to prison and my meeting did not take place. After a delay of 30 years, my Elbe is here today. I am here to tell you what we wanted to tell you then." Now, Stalin used a tactic called psychological projection, or blame shifting, is where a politician publicly accuses his opponent of what he himself is guilty of. Karl Marx is attributed with the quote, "Accuse others of what you do." Solzhenitsyn was quoted in The Observer, December 29th of 1974. "In our country, the lie has become not just a moral category, but a pillar of the state." Solzhenitsyn warned Americans not to trust mainstream media in 1975. "There is a Russian proverb, 'The yes man is your enemy, but your friend will argue with you.' I am the friend. I have come to tell you. One of your leading newspapers after the end of Vietnam had a full headline, 'Blessed Silence.' I would not wish that kind of blessed silence on my worst enemies. I spent 11 years in the archipelago labor camps." Solzhenitsyn went on, "You know the words of the Bible, 'Build not on sand, but on rock.' Lenin's teachings are that anyone is considered to be a fool who doesn't take what's lying in front of him. If you can take it, take it. If you can attack, attack. But if there's a wall, then go back. Communist leaders respect only firmness and have contempt and laugh at persons who continually give in to them." Philosopher Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan, 1651, "Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues." Richard Nixon, in his address August 21st, 1960, titled "The Meaning of Communism to Americans," he said, "The major problem confronting the people of the United States is communism. The test is one not so much of arms, but of faith. Communism denies God, enslaves men, destroys justice. The appeal of the communist idea is not to the masses, but to the intelligent minority. It has failed in its promise of equality and abundance. It has produced disillusionment and a steady stream of men, women, and children seeking to escape its blight. Communism is a false idea. Solzhenitsyn, similarly, concluded his speech in Washington, D.C., 1975. I call upon America to be more careful with its trust, prevent those who are attempting to establish even finer legal shades of equality, because their distorted outlook, short-sightedness, and self-interest from falsely using the struggle for peace and social justice to lead you down a false road. They are trying to weaken you. They are trying to disarm your strong and magnificent country in the face of this fearful threat, one that has never been seen before in the history of the world. I call upon you, ordinary working men of America, do not let yourselves become weak. He continued, if we don't know our own history, we will simply have to endure the same mistakes, sacrifices, and absurdities all over again. Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, 1973, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Solzhenitsyn received the Templeton Prize for Progress in 1983. He said, we can only reach with determination for the warm hand of God, which we have so rashly and self-confidently pushed away. Well, this has been a discussion of Soviet Russia, and during the time when they did not believe in God and the terrible things happening in Ukraine, and a warning for us today not to fall for the temptation of the promises of socialism. Well, hope you've enjoyed this. God bless you.